The first light of dawn in ancient Sparta was not something to be enjoyed. It was a command, a summons. The sky over the Eurotas River glowed cold and pale, casting long blue shadows across the city-state carved into the rocky Peloponnesian soil. There were no gentle morning routines here, no slow rise from warm beds. Sparta did not believe in comfort. It believed in duty. And if you had been born within these walls, you would have known from the moment you could stand that your life belonged to something far bigger and far more brutal than yourself. But before we wander further into this harsh, unrelenting corner of the ancient world, I ask you to pause and support this journey. Tap the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. Whether you're resting in a quiet apartment or tuning in from a countryside road, it's always remarkable to see how these echoes from the past ripple across the present. Imagine waking up at the age of 7, not in your family home, but in a barracks. That's when your real life would have begun. You'd have already been inspected by Spartan elders at birth. If you had any sign of weakness, an abnormality, a frailty, you wouldn't have lived past your first few days. Infants were bathed in wine, not to clean them, but to test their strength. Those who didn't cry or stiffen were considered promising. Those who did were left behind. But let's say you survived. At 7, you were ripped from your family and dropped into the Agog, the Spartan military education system that cared nothing for tears or protest. From that point on, you weren't a son. You were a trainee, a future soldier, a tool. The days started in silence. No songs, no lullabies, no warmth. You learned to march before you learned to write. You trained with fists, then with sticks, then with blades. Pain was a constant. Bruises weren't signs of injury. They were signs of progress. If you cried, you were mocked. If you complained, you were punished. If you fell behind, you were left behind. The Agog didn't mold boys into men. It stripped boys down to bone and rebuilt them into weapons. And still, you were expected to steal, not because the Spartans encouraged theft, but because they believed it taught cunning. If you were caught, you weren't punished for taking something. You were punished for being caught. Punishment could mean flogging, public beatings, or worse. Silence during suffering wasn't just admired, it was required. Legend tells of boys being whipped until their skin broke and their backs bled, all without a single cry. At night, you didn't sleep in a bed. You slept on reeds, pulled from the riverbank. No blanket, no pillow, no fire. Hunger gnawed at you. Fatigue haunted you. But asking for rest was unthinkable. The only nourishment you received, apart from your sparse rations, came in the form of songs about honor and death, chanted in unison by boys too tired to remember their own names. The older boys would train you, not as mentors, but as enforcers. They were allowed to strike you, humiliate you, and push you until your body ached and your spirit buckled. They had endured the same treatment and now passed it on with cold precision. There was no kindness, only hierarchy. Back in the barracks, your name was rarely used. You were not an individual. You were part of the phalanx, even before you knew what that meant. Individuality was considered dangerous. Questioning authority was treasonous. You didn't speak unless spoken to. And when you did, you kept it short, sharp, and clever. The Spartans revered brevity. They called it laconic speech, named for Laconia, the region Sparta controlled. Wit and restraint were more valued than eloquence. There were no books, no philosophy lectures, no time for wandering thoughts. The only lesson was obedience. The only goal was strength. And the only acceptable fate was victory or death. This wasn't just training. It was transformation, and it had only just begun. By the time a Spartan boy emerged from the Agog, typically around age 20, he was no longer a boy in any conventional sense. He was transformed, his softness carved away, his fears cauterized. What remained was a weapon, living and breathing, calibrated to obey, to fight, and to endure. He had been forged like iron in fire, and graduation from the Agog was not an end, but merely a transition, from institutional training to lifelong service. For the Spartan male, the road ahead was no gentler than the path behind. It simply changed shape, from tutelage to expectation, from molding to maintenance. Between the ages of 20 and 30, even if he married, a Spartan man did not reside at home. Instead, he lived in the barracks with his military peers, sleeping on hard beds and rising to the same relentless rhythms. Marital life was a side note. Visits to one's wife were stealthy, brief, and conducted under nightfall. More obligation than intimacy. Love was irrelevant. The primary goal was procreation, and even that served the state. Domestic comforts were suspect. Attachment was weakness. Meals were no escape. Food, like everything else, was communal, structured, and designed without regard for pleasure. You and your mess group, known as a syssitia, usually about 15 men, ate together daily. The infamous black broth, brewed from pig's blood, vinegar, and herbs, was not a punishment. It was tradition. Outsiders found it disgusting. Spartans called it dinner. Complaints were ignored or punished. Hunger was preferable to indulgence. In battle, the Spartan phalanx was a moving wall of death. Shields overlapped perfectly, forming an unbroken barrier. Spears protruded forward like a bristling maw. Individual prowess meant nothing. The only measure of valor was your discipline in the line, your unflinching protection of the man to your left. You did not shield yourself. You shielded the unit. If the formation broke, all was lost. And breaking formation was not a tactical error. It was a moral failure. Discipline was enforced not just by officers, but by your comrades. The system thrived on relentless peer scrutiny. Every movement, every decision, every hesitation was observed and judged. Honor wasn't displayed in speeches or slogans. It existed in the silence of your endurance, in how well you held the line, in how little pain you showed when blood was drawn or bones snapped. Those who faltered faced public humiliation. A man who fled from battle was branded a coward, condemned to wear mismatched clothing, shave only half his beard, and live as an object of shame. Children would mock him in the streets. Women would reject him. Friends would turn away. Cowardice was not rehabilitated. It was paraded. Spartan women, while not soldiers, were raised with similar expectations of toughness. Girls trained their bodies through running, wrestling, and throwing javelins. Strength in women was valued not for combat, but for childbirth. A strong woman would ideally bear strong sons. Yet, women were more than vessels. They could own property, manage estates, and speak with a bluntness that startled visitors. A Spartan mother's farewell to her son was chilling. Come back with your shield, or on it. Survival was secondary to valor. From cradle to grave, Spartan life was an exercise in subordination. Comfort was not a right. Individual joy was not a goal. Readiness was everything. Even in times of peace, war pulsed in the background. The arts, when permitted, existed only to reinforce values. Music was martial. Dance resembled drill. Religion exalted war and obedience. Festivals such as the Karnaya and the Gymnopedia offered no reprieve. Celebrations were militarized. Rituals honored fallen warriors. Youths competed in rigorous contests, not for fame, but to affirm their place in Sparta's hierarchy. Even joy wore armor. Privacy did not exist. Autonomy was foreign. From the moment a Spartan was born, the city owned them, their limbs, their will, their voice. What emerged from this crucible was not a man in the typical sense, but a function of the state, obedient, unbreakable, and disposable. To survive in ancient Sparta, was not just to endure hardship. It was to become hardship incarnate, shaped into a living emblem of discipline and sacrifice. To understand how Spartan life broke down the individual, we need to look at the framework that held it all together, the state itself. Sparta wasn't just a city, it was a fully engineered system, a relentless machine built with unwavering discipline and ruthless precision. Everything it touched became molded in its image. It was designed for one purpose: to maintain a society capable of withstanding both internal rebellion and external threats, no matter the human cost. At the very core of this system was a dangerous imbalance, a tiny, elite, ruling class of full Spartan citizens known as the Spartiates, who stood atop a much larger, deeply oppressed population. This disparity wasn't incidental. It was the fuel that powered the Spartan engine. And the paranoia it created infiltrated every corner of life. The backbone of Spartan labor was the Helots, a subjugated population mostly comprised of conquered Messenians. These were not merely servants. They were enslaved people whose lives were stripped of freedom, dignity, and protection. They plowed the fields, harvested the crops, tended the livestock, and performed the menial but essential tasks that made Spartan society possible. While the Spartiates trained for war and lived in barracks, the Helots worked the land that provided the food. But their labor came with tension. Helots outnumbered the Spartiates by staggering margins. Some estimates say as many as 7-1. That imbalance bred constant fear, and the solution to that fear was institutionalized terror. Each year, in a formal, state-sanctioned act, the ephors, the 5 annually elected Spartan magistrates, declared war on the Helot population. This wasn't a metaphor. It was an official declaration that allowed Spartans to kill Helots at will without religious consequence. It wasn't just policy. It was ritualized psychological warfare. Young men in the Cryptia, a secretive force drawn from elite Spartan youth, were tasked with stalking and assassinating Helots who seemed too strong, too bold, or too intelligent. The message was clear: stay low, stay silent, or disappear. Helots were humiliated through enforced dress, overworked with brutal agricultural quotas, and paraded as warnings to others. Their suffering was the backdrop to every Spartan victory. For Spartiates, superiority wasn't simply assumed. It was reaffirmed constantly through systemic cruelty. Above the Helots, but still carefully excluded from full privilege, were the perioikoi, the dwellers around. These were free but not citizens. They lived in surrounding villages, handled trade, crafted weapons, built tools, and managed the types of economic and artisan work that Spartans considered beneath them. The perioikoi were soldiers when called upon and indispensable to the economy. But politically, they had no voice, no vote, and no real power. They were permitted to exist and contribute, but never to influence. Spartan government presented itself as balanced, but it was a tightly controlled oligarchy. 2 hereditary kings ruled simultaneously, a holdover from an ancient power-sharing agreement between royal families. These kings served dual roles as wartime generals and religious leaders, but their powers were checked by the Gerousia, a council of elders over the age of 60. Proposed laws originated in this council and were then presented to the Apella, an assembly of male citizens. Yet the ephors often held the true reins of control. These 5 officials oversaw civil law, education, diplomacy, and internal security. They could put kings on trial and shape policy in ways that seemed above reproach. Their presence ensured that no one, not even a monarch, was safe from scrutiny in Sparta. Every phase of life in Sparta was ritualized, militarized, and subordinated to the needs of the state. Infants were examined by a council of elders shortly after birth. If they appeared sickly or malformed, they were taken to the base of Mount Taygetus and left to die from exposure. This act, debated among historians for its scale, nonetheless reflects the cruel pragmatism ingrained in Spartan philosophy. Childhood was no escape from hardship. Young Spartans underwent brutal training under the agage, a state-run educational and military system designed to instill obedience, endurance, and skill in combat. Boys were whipped for stealing food, but praised if they succeeded in stealing without being caught. The lesson wasn't moral, it was tactical. Even language served the state. The Spartans were famously laconic. They spoke in short, sharp phrases designed to avoid embellishment and encourage clarity. Conversation was not for speculation or introspection. It was for giving orders, receiving them, or surviving social tests. Their songs reinforced collective memory, glorified past victories, and drilled national pride. Their stories were carefully curated. Their silences were part of the message. To exist in Sparta was to exist under surveillance, not just from the state, but from one another. Friendship, if it could be called that, was a function of mutual testing in training grounds and shared hardship. Individual identity was erased and replaced with a collective one. Every meal was shared. Every bed was hard. Every day was a trial. So, if you imagine yourself living in ancient Sparta, understand that the test was not singular. It was continuous. The challenge was not only in battle, but in compliance, in silence, in every breath taken under the weight of expectation. You would not be praised for who you were. You would be judged only by how perfectly you fit into a mold shaped by fear, war, and absolute control. And for most, that weight was unbearable. To fully comprehend the mental and emotional demands of living in ancient Sparta, one must realize that even rest was transformed into a tool of the state. Leisure as we understand it today was not merely absent, it was actively discouraged, even feared. A relaxed mind or body was seen as a chink in the armor, a moment where the soul could be corrupted by softness. Sleep wasn't an escape. It was another battleground. Spartan boys, enrolled from the age of 7 into the grueling regime known as the agoga, were trained to sleep under minimal cover, without the comfort of fire, even during bitter winters. This wasn't framed as a punishment. It was a crucible. Boys were expected to rise without being told, to act without hesitation, and to suppress any expression of discomfort. Warmth was indulgence. Fatigue was the price of excellence. Suffering, if acknowledged at all, was merely a step toward invincibility. The agagi was not an education in the usual sense. It was a forge that tried to burn away everything human in favor of something harder, leaner, more useful. Children were pulled from their homes and families and raised in communal barracks where individuality was erased. Their hair was shaved off, and they were given a single garment to wear throughout the year. Footwear was forbidden. Meals were insufficient by design, encouraging hunger as a constant companion and incentive to steal. But even that was a test. If caught, punishment was not for the theft, but for being discovered. The lessons were clear: strength above comfort, cleverness above honesty, survival above fairness. Punishment came often and without warning. Disobedience was met with beatings, doled out not only by superiors but even by peers. Discipline was constant and unquestionable. And yet, success brought no celebration, no special treatment. There were no accolades, no trophies. Survival was its own quiet reward. The message was as harsh as the training. Do not expect praise. Expect only to endure. Even family ties were eroded. The bonds between parents and children, between siblings, were considered secondary to the allegiance owed to Sparta. Mothers, while respected, were not celebrated for affection or nurturing. Instead, they were honored for raising sons who would die without fear. The ideal Spartan mother did not cry when her son fell in battle. She bore it with silence, pride, and perhaps a single stoic phrase: "He did his duty." Public mourning was discouraged. Private grief was a weakness. Girls in Sparta lived under different expectations than in other Greek city-states, but were still molded by the same ideology. Unlike their counterparts in Athens or Corinth, Spartan girls received state-sponsored education. They were taught to run, wrestle, throw javelins, and speak their minds. Strength and resilience were drilled into them, not for their own benefit, but to ensure they could bear strong sons. Their bodies were not their own. They were vessels for future warriors. Their minds were shaped to value toughness over tenderness, dominance over deference. Even in their relative freedom, they served the state's interests. Marriage was never a matter of affection. Love, in the modern sense, had no real function. Men remained in communal barracks with fellow soldiers until age 30, and marriages were often arranged for procreation alone. Husbands might sneak away from barracks at night to visit their wives. A strong and healthy wife was more valuable than a beautiful one. Fertility was a duty. Emotional intimacy was not expected, and if it existed, it was quietly tolerated rather than celebrated. Discipline in adulthood did not ease. The relentless oversight of the Crypteia, a secretive and brutal institution, lingered well past adolescence. Spartans, even in full adulthood, lived under surveillance, judged not just by their actions, but by their posture, their speech, their silence. The line between governance and control blurred completely. Culture was permitted only when it served the state. Music and dance were allowed, but strictly regulated, performed in group rituals to instill unity and pride. There were no personal songs, no art to challenge convention. Intellectual exploration, so beloved in Athens, was dismissed as dangerous decadence. The cost of this tightly wound social model was unsustainable fragility. Full citizens, known as Spartiates, were always a small minority. The rigid requirements to maintain their status ensured that their numbers dwindled with every generation. A single failure in the agoge, a financial mishap, or the loss of honor could strip one of citizenship. The result was a ruling class that was constantly thinning, increasingly unable to control the Helot majority. Sparta's strength was built on exclusion, and its invincibility came with the price of constant internal erosion. So if you imagine life in Sparta, forget the cinematic imagery of glistening warriors standing triumphant. Imagine a cold barracks, a stomach gnawed by hunger, eyes that never linger too long, and a voice that rarely speaks. Imagine silence as praise, exhaustion as virtue, and the only reward being the chance to do it all again tomorrow. To be Spartan was not to be celebrated. It was to be invisible until death, and then remembered not by name, but as a number on a battlefield. Beyond the military regimen and the state's fixation on discipline, what truly set ancient Sparta apart was its complex, often chilling relationship with fear. In most civilizations, fear is a force to be overcome or endured, a response to danger that civilization seeks to soothe through stability, justice, and compassion. But in Sparta, fear was not just accepted, it was institutionalized, cultivated, and deployed as a conscious tool of governance. Fear was interwoven into the very marrow of Spartan life, particularly through its policies toward the Helot population. These Helots, native peoples of the region who had been conquered and enslaved, vastly outnumbered their Spartan overlords. They farmed the land, produced the food, and maintained the economy so that the Spartiate class, full Spartan citizens, could devote themselves entirely to training for war. The system could not function without the Helots, yet it existed in perpetual paranoia over their potential rebellion. To suppress this possibility, Sparta created a system of terror that was not just tolerated, but exalted. Young Spartan men, still teenagers, were inducted into the Crypteia, a secret police whose mission was to operate at night, stalking and killing Helots who were seen as a threat, or sometimes seemingly at random. There was no trial, no defense, no public record. The murders were done in darkness, in silence, without consequence. This was not justice. It was ritualized terror. These acts were not crimes. They were state policy. And they sent a chilling message. The helots were never safe. Every shadow might conceal a blade. Every creaking floorboard might signal death. The helots were forced to live in constant degradation. They wore demeaning clothing meant to shame them publicly. They were routinely humiliated in rituals designed to reinforce their subjugation. They could never carry weapons, never train, never speak of resistance. Their existence was one of silent compliance, reinforced by the looming threat of sudden violence. Their fear was not a flaw in the system. It was the fuel that kept it running. And yet, this same machinery of oppression cast a shadow over the Spartans themselves. Every young boy trained in the agage knew that one day he might be tasked with killing another human in the night. Every adult Spartiate knew that a single spark among the helots could ignite a fire that would consume the entire city-state. Beneath the armor and the stoicism was a collective, unspoken dread, the knowledge that their supremacy rested on a knife's edge. Economically, Sparta was frozen in a strange and paradoxical stasis. While they disdained wealth and luxury as corrupting influences, they also depended heavily on a stable and productive helot labor force to maintain their agrarian economy. To discourage greed and commerce, currency in Sparta took the form of unwieldy iron bars, intentionally made difficult to carry or hoard. There were no great markets, no flourishing trade networks, no merchant class. The Spartans saw innovation not as progress, but as threat. Change was synonymous with decay. Where Athens thrived on debate, invention, and artistry, Sparta chose austerity and rigidity. The only true currency in their society was honor, earned through unwavering discipline and battlefield valor, not through personal wealth, artistry, or intellectual pursuit. Religion in Sparta reflected the same unbending severity that defined its politics and education. The gods were worshipped not through personal reflection or philosophical inquiry, but through strict, often brutal public rituals that demanded demonstration of piety through suffering and endurance. Major festivals like the Carnaia and Hyacinthia were not only religious observances, but civic exhibitions of strength and conformity. Perhaps most famously, the rites of Artemis Orthia involved young boys being whipped at the altar until their flesh bled, sometimes fatally. This was not an aberration. It was the ideal. Pain was proof of devotion. Survival through agony was a sacred expression of loyalty to Sparta and its divine protectors. And what of art, literature, philosophy? In Sparta, they withered. There were no renowned playwrights, no philosophers crafting new theories of governance or ethics. There were no scholars debating the nature of the soul. In fact, the written word itself had little standing. Spartan life was preserved not in poetry or historical record, but in action, in legend, in the muscle memory of repetition. What little we know comes from the outside, Athenians, Romans, and later historians who marveled at this strange, silent society that seemed to reject every hallmark of human expression in favor of an uncompromising ideal. Over time, the illusion of perfection could not be sustained. A society that builds itself solely for war, for honor, and for unchanging discipline may endure for a time, but it cannot thrive indefinitely. Sparta did not evolve. It could not adapt. As the Greek world moved forward, experimenting with democracy, advancing science, embracing new military strategies, Sparta hardened, calcified, and eventually began to crack. The warrior state became an anachronism, outpaced by enemies who understood that survival required more than steel and silence. Had you lived in ancient Sparta, you might have survived your first day, perhaps even your first week. But slowly, inevitably, the weight would press in. You would learn to suppress curiosity, to distrust comfort, to fear softness. You would become thinner, colder, quieter, until you no longer recognize the thoughts that used to rise freely in your mind. And that, more than the hunger, more than the training, more than the pain, was the true toll of Spartan life, the erasure of the self in service of the state. In Sparta, individuality was not just frowned upon, it was a liability, and in time, it was extinguished. Despite its harshness, the Spartan system was not born of cruelty for its own sake. Rather, it was a calculated response to a deeply unstable geographic and political reality. Sparta sat in the Peloponnesus, surrounded by both natural rivals and oppressed peoples. Its population of Spartiates was always small, perhaps never more than a few thousand. Meanwhile, the Helots, enslaved locals bound to the land, outnumbered the citizens by a ratio some estimated to be as high as 7-1. This created a permanent state of tension where the entire society was organized to keep control through fear, vigilance, and readiness for sudden violence. Every element of Spartan life, from its militarized education to its public punishments, was calibrated not for growth or prosperity, but for survival in a hostile, unstable equilibrium. This obsessive need for control shaped not just institutions, but minds. From the earliest age, Spartans were taught that the highest virtue was obedience. Children did not belong to their families, but to the state. Loyalty to Sparta superseded all other ties. Even the bonds between mother and child, between husband and wife, were conditioned by the demands of the city. Fathers were expected to be distant and stern. Mothers were expected to praise their sons not for kindness, not for cleverness, but for courage and sacrifice. The ideal son died on the battlefield, not in bed. The ideal woman gave birth to warriors and buried them with pride. In such a world, tenderness was dangerous. Love, in its unguarded form, was a threat to order. Education, too, was shaped around this grim utilitarianism. The agage, that infamous system of military schooling, did not teach creativity, history, or inquiry. Instead, it taught discipline, endurance, deception, and cruelty. Young boys were encouraged to steal food, not because stealing was seen as acceptable, but because it tested resourcefulness, and being caught meant punishment, reinforcing vigilance. They were beaten for speaking too much, for expressing weakness, or for showing too much emotion. Their friendships were monitored, their movements restricted, their imaginations starved. By adulthood, they were expected to embody the Spartan ideal: silent, controlled, deadly. Even leisure was not truly leisure. Physical training continued throughout life, and the rare communal meals, the syssitia, were not scenes of relaxation but further reinforcement of conformity. All citizens were required to eat in groups, with common rations and strict behavioral expectations. These meals were arenas for surveillance as much as sustenance. A misplaced word, a hint of arrogance or weakness, could mark one as suspect. No part of the day was free from scrutiny. And yet, even within this steel-bound world, cracks sometimes showed. There were Spartans who yearned for music, for stories, for a kind of beauty their society refused to nourish. Some left Sparta and became mercenaries in foreign armies, their legendary discipline sought after by kings across the Mediterranean. Others found ways to express themselves in defiance of the norms, though such acts were rare and often suppressed. The society's rigidity ensured its security, but it also ensured its stagnation. In time, Sparta's enemies learned how to fight not just with equal courage, but with better tools, better strategies, and more flexible thinking. The Thebans, the Macedonians, and later the Romans all observed Spartan methods, adapted what worked, and discarded what didn't. Sparta remained frozen, a relic of an earlier time. And when it finally did fall, it was not to a siege or a dramatic betrayal. It fell to irrelevance. The world changed, and Sparta did not. And so it was left behind, to live in Sparta was to live under a constant weight, not just the weight of expectation, but the weight of history, ideology, and fear. Every breath you took was measured. Every step you walked was watched. Every thought you entertained had consequences. The city demanded not just your body, but your soul. And if you couldn't surrender both, it would break you or erase you. Spartan life to an outsider might have seemed obsessively focused on war, but it wasn't just the battlefield that demanded strength or courage. Every element of existence was carved from stone-hard discipline, shaped by the unforgiving mold of tradition, and maintained through a culture that prized endurance over comfort and silence over noise. Even simple daily conversation was filtered through a harsh code of conduct. Spartans were famed across the ancient Greek world for their laconic speech, words short, sharp, and stripped of anything that might be considered fluff or flourish. In Sparta, to speak in long, winding sentences was not simply frowned upon. It was considered a flaw of character, a sign of vanity or indecisiveness. From childhood, boys were trained not only in combat, but also in control, of movement, of appetite, of emotion, and of language. The modern term laconic owes its name to Laconia, the region in which Sparta was situated. If you asked a Spartan a question that others might answer with paragraphs, he would reply with a single word, and his one word often carried more weight than your many. It wasn't just about speech, it was about power. To control your tongue was to show mastery over self, and anything more was regarded as indulgent, wasteful. The social hierarchy reflected the same cold precision. At the summit were the Spartiates, the full citizens of Sparta, all male, all warriors, all bound by land ownership and status passed down through blood and battlefield valor. Beneath them lived the perioikoi, free inhabitants who were not citizens, tradesmen, craftsmen, and merchants who fulfilled essential roles in the functioning of the economy. At the base of the pyramid were the helots, the enslaved majority who did the actual work of farming, harvesting, and maintaining the households. The helots were not just a working class. They were a people constantly held under threat, outnumbering the Spartans by many times and seen less as laborers than as a population to be managed through fear and terror. Every year, the Spartans would formally declare war on the helots. This declaration wasn't symbolic. It legalized violence against them. One of the most sinister institutions in this regard was the Cryptia, a secret operation wherein young Spartan men, still in training, were sent into the countryside to kill helots under cover of night. This was considered a test of skill, obedience, and ruthlessness. It wasn't a legend meant to scare children. It was policy, wrapped in ritual. Religion in Sparta was no exception to this broader philosophy. While other city-states like Athens used myth and theater to explore the divine, Spartan religious life was pragmatic, direct, and reinforcing of their militaristic values. Their gods weren't tricksters or muses of poetry. They were stern judges, guardians of duty and honor. Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and protector of young women, held a particularly powerful place in Spartan worship. She wasn't adored for mystery, but for discipline. At the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, Spartan boys were flogged in front of crowds, not as punishment, but as proof of endurance. Some died during these brutal rites. The crowd did not look away. They cheered. To endure pain without flinching was an offering to the gods, a signal that one was fit for society. Girls had rights, too, less bloody, but still centered on physical challenge and spiritual submission. Religion wasn't comfort. It was command. Marriage in Sparta was just as stark and ritualized. Romantic love, as understood in later centuries, had no place in the Spartan worldview. Men typically married in their 20s, but even then, they were not allowed to live with their wives until they reached their 30s. The union existed for reproduction, specifically the production of strong sons who could one day take up spear and shield. Early in marriage, husbands would sneak away from their barracks to visit their wives, often in secret, at night. This bizarrely distant arrangement was intentional. It kept men loyal to their military unit while still populating the next generation. Interestingly, Spartan women had considerably more rights and visibility than their counterparts elsewhere in Greece. They managed households, owned land, and were educated. They trained physically and were expected to be as strong in body as they were in resolve. A famous Spartan woman once told a traveler, "Only Spartan women give birth to real men." This was not a boast. It was a civic truth. Weakness had no place in Sparta, not in man, woman, or child. So if you picture ancient Sparta as merely an army camp or a battlefield etched into the dust, you're missing the essence. What you'd find was a city where silence was sculpted, where a poorly chosen word marked you as unfit, where gods were honored through wounds, and where every step you took had to match the rigid rhythm of a life built not for comfort or curiosity, but for survival, for conformity, and above all, for strength. Even rest, even thought, had to be earned through hardship. Sparta wasn't just a city, it was a crucible. And to live in it meant becoming something unrecognizably hardened or being discarded altogether. To live in ancient Sparta was to enter into an unyielding world of extremes, a society carved from granite ideals where comfort was an afterthought and softness a threat. If you didn't grow up Spartan, the adjustment would be punishing. Survival here had nothing to do with charm, status, or intellect. In Sparta, you either became part of the machinery of war, or you were cast aside. The land itself reflected this brutality, rugged, dry, and hemmed in by mountains. It was a place that didn't forgive weakness and made no apologies for that. From the moment of birth, your life was not your own. If you were a Spartan boy, your body belonged to the state. Your cries were not met with lullabies, but with scrutiny. Elders inspected newborns like tools in a forge. If you were sickly, malformed, or too small, your life ended before it had truly begun, exposed on the rocks of Mount Taygetus to die by cold or nature. They didn't call it cruelty, they called it necessary. But before we go further into the steel-edged life of ancient Sparta, take a moment to support this journey. Tap the like button if you're finding this glimpse into the ancient world intriguing. Subscribe if you haven't already, and share in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Whether you're tuning in from a quiet kitchen or settling into sleep in a city that never rests, it's always remarkable to see where history reaches. Now, let's return to Sparta. By age 7, your childhood, as most people would understand it, was already over. Spartan boys were removed from their families and thrust into the agoge, a brutal state-run training program designed to forge warriors out of children. You wouldn't see your mother again except from a distance. In the agage, affection was replaced by endurance. You slept in shared quarters with minimal bedding and learned to withstand hunger, cold, and violence. You were encouraged to steal food, but not to get caught. Punishment wasn't for theft. It was for failure. There were no rewards for trying, only for succeeding by Spartan terms. Pain was constant, and you were taught to embrace it, even welcome it, in silence. Crying was forbidden. Complaint was weakness. The instructors didn't teach compassion. They taught survival. Beyond physical strength, you were taught cunning. Not the kind of wit admired in Athenian drama, but a stripped-down battlefield intelligence. You learned to think like a predator. Quick, silent, strategic. Brevity in speech was enforced. Long conversations were pointless. A true Spartan should make his meaning known in a single, razor-sharp sentence. The culture idolized few words and absolute action. You would be shaped not into a man, but into a weapon. Lean, cold, and efficient. Girls in Sparta, too, were shaped for the state. Unlike in other parts of Greece, they trained. They ran races, wrestled, threw javelins, and built strength. The reasoning was practical. Strong women bore strong children. Marriage was a transaction, not a romance. A good Spartan woman was valued not for beauty, but for her ability to contribute to the war machine. And yet, Spartan women had more power than their Athenian counterparts. They could own land, manage property, and were known to speak their minds. But even their freedoms existed within the tight grip of Spartan ideals. Everything, love, childbirth, even laughter, was secondary to Sparta's one sacred goal: military supremacy. Food in Sparta was not cuisine. It was sustenance, and barely that. Meals were taken in communal messes, with other soldiers or trainees. And the goal wasn't pleasure. It was endurance. The infamous black broth made from pig's blood, vinegar, and barley was a staple. Outsiders found it revolting. Spartans considered it a test of spirit. If you could drink it without gagging, maybe you had a Spartan heart. Maybe. Imagine coming from anywhere else, anywhere with lullabies, celebrations, or even just a bit of sugar in your food, and finding yourself in Sparta. Imagine being expected to cast off emotion, to abandon comfort, to welcome pain like a friend. Imagine being seen not as a person, but as a vessel for strength and obedience. This city did not nurture. It chiseled. It did not raise children. It forged warriors. And if you couldn't endure it, you didn't belong. To live in ancient Sparta wasn't to live in the way we understand the word. It was to serve, to submit, and to survive. Barely. It wasn't a society that broke you on purpose. It simply didn't care if you broke. Daily life for a Spartan adult was still far from what anyone today would call peaceful or secure. The agoge may have ended around the age of 20, but that didn't mean your trials were over. In fact, for a true Spartan citizen, a Spartiates, the pressure only intensified. You were expected to join a syssitia, a kind of military dining club where you ate all your meals with your unit, not your family. Admission wasn't automatic. You had to be voted in, and rejection meant social death. If you weren't accepted, you were excluded from political life and elite standing. You were an outcast in the very society you were born to serve. Training never really stopped. Spartans didn't retire from war. They just died in it. Until age 60, every man was expected to be combat ready. Even in times of peace, drills, inspections, and mock battles were routine. Your armor and weapons were always within reach. There were no holidays from discipline. Relaxation, as we understand it, didn't exist. Your identity was tethered to your shield and spear. You weren't a farmer, craftsman, or thinker. You were a soldier, forever. Meanwhile, the rest of your life, your home, your land, your children, was managed largely by others. Spartan citizens didn't farm. That work fell to the helots, a vast and brutally oppressed class of state-owned serfs. These helots were the economic backbone of Sparta, working the fields so the warrior class could focus entirely on combat. But they were not forgotten, nor were they safe. Each year, Sparta declared ritual war on the helots, allowing young Spartans to legally kill them without repercussion. This wasn't just control. It was psychological warfare, a warning system embedded into the culture. If you were one of those helots, life was even more brutal than the Spartans' austere existence. You could be killed for being too strong, too defiant, or simply too visible. You were expected to live silently, obediently, and invisibly. Yet your labor fed the entire society. Rebellion was always simmering, and Sparta was always afraid of it, which only made their grip tighter, harsher, more paranoid. Spartan men didn't live with their wives, even after marriage. You stayed in your barracks with your fellow soldiers. Visits to your home were brief and often secret. Children were raised by the state, not by parents. Emotional bonds were considered dangerous distractions. The state needed unity, not individuality. Personal happiness wasn't just unimportant, it was a liability. There was little space for art or philosophy in Sparta. While Athens boasted playwrights, sculptors, and thinkers like Socrates and Plato, Sparta saw such pursuits as decadent and wasteful. Music existed, but it served a function. War songs, hymns for the gods, training chants. Poetry had its place, but only if it reinforced discipline and glory in battle. Intellectuals were not admired. Warriors were. Even aging brought no peace. Old Spartans were honored, yes, but only if they had proven themselves on the battlefield. A long life without glory was not necessarily a respected one. The measure of a man was not his wisdom or compassion, but his scars and how many he had taken with him to the grave. A good death in war was the ideal. Anything else risked being seen as cowardice or failure. And so, if you had somehow survived your brutal upbringing, if you had passed through the fire of the Agage and gained full citizenship, you still lived under the crushing weight of Spartan expectation. Every day was an extension of the battlefield. Every breath was a pledge to your city, and if you stumbled, if you hesitated, questioned, or failed, there was no sympathy waiting for you. There was only the void left behind by those who couldn't endure. The social ladder in Sparta wasn't just steep, it was carved in stone. And for those who didn't fit the mold of a perfect warrior, the consequences were swift and cruel. Let's say you were born with a physical deformity or didn't seem strong enough in infancy. You weren't pitied. You were taken to the base of Mount Tegetus and left exposed to the elements. The official justification was that Sparta had no place for weakness. Mercy was a foreign concept. From birth, your worth was measured in how well you could serve the state. If you were a Spartan woman, your life was radically different from that of other women in the ancient world, and not necessarily in the ways you might expect. Spartan girls were educated, trained in athletics, and encouraged to speak their minds. They ran races, threw javelins, and were expected to be physically strong to bear strong children. They weren't cloistered in the home or married off at puberty like in other Greek cities. But make no mistake, their independence wasn't about empowerment. It was functional. Spartan women were bred to produce warriors. Their bodies belonged to the state as much as their husbands' spears did. Marriage wasn't about love or companionship. It was about creating the next generation of soldiers. Women could own land in Sparta, a rarity in the ancient world, and they controlled a surprising amount of wealth. But even that came with strings attached. This wasn't financial freedom. It was a logistical necessity, as men were rarely home and constantly at war or in training. Women filled the void out of obligation, not opportunity. They were respected, yes, but as extensions of the Spartan war machine. There was also an eerie ritualism to daily life in Sparta. Religious festivals often involved bloodletting or ritual flagellation. At the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, young boys were whipped before an audience until they collapsed or even died. This wasn't punishment. It was a test of endurance and a spectacle of national pride. Imagine standing in a temple, cheering as a child was scourged nearly to death and calling it noble. That was Sparta. Privacy was nearly non-existent. Conformity was sacred. From the way you dressed, simple, functional tunics, with no luxury or decoration, to the way you ate, slept, and spoke, everything was regulated. Silence was a virtue. Spartan boys were taught to speak rarely and briefly. Eloquence was not valued. Action was. To talk too much was to draw attention, and in Sparta, attention could be dangerous. The city itself reflected its values. There were no grand temples or lavish buildings like in Athens. Streets were practical. Homes were modest. Wealth was deliberately hidden. The aim was unity, equality, and martial excellence, but only within the ruling class. The helots still toiled at the bottom, brutally reminded every day of their place in this system. Even religion served the state. The gods were not worshipped for personal salvation, but for victory in battle and the preservation of order. War wasn't just an act of politics or defense. It was sacred. Bloodshed had a divine sanction. Warriors marched not just with armor, but with divine purpose. And what of the moments between wars? There were none. Peace was merely the preparation for the next campaign. Sparta never stopped bracing for the next threat, real or imagined. This was a society with no off switch, where even leisure had to justify itself through service to strength. To live in Sparta was to exist in permanent readiness, permanently watched, permanently judged. So by now, it should be clear. If you were dropped into ancient Sparta, even with your modern mindset, even with some preparation, you'd be overwhelmed. Not just by the physical demands, but by the mental siege of conformity, ritual, surveillance, and sacrifice. This wasn't just a city, it was a forge, and not everyone survived the fire. If you've ever wondered what it truly meant to live in a society where the boundary between civilian and soldier was almost non-existent, ancient Sparta offers a harsh, unfiltered glimpse into that reality. Discipline was not seasonal or situational. It was lifelong, absolute, and inescapable. From the moment a Spartan boy could walk, the wheels of the state began turning against him, molding him into a creature of loyalty, resilience, and calculated violence. Aging did not excuse one from these demands. It merely altered the form of service. In Sparta, the individual dissolved into the machinery of the polis. Autonomy was an illusion. Every male citizen, regardless of age or injury, was expected to function as a living instrument of the state's will. For those who survived long enough to see their hair gray and their limbs weaken, there was no relief. The city simply redirected their purpose. The Gerousia, or Council of Elders, consisted of men over the age of 60, but this was not a place for soft landings. Rather, it was a crucible in which only the hardest men endured. These elders were not only survivors of decades of war and training, they were products of unrelenting rigor, selected not for comfort but for their embodiment of Spartan ideals. They shared power with the city's dual kings, but in practice they often wielded even more influence. The Gerousia deliberated on legislation, dispensed justice, and guarded the ethical backbone of Spartan society. Their authority seeped into every corner of Spartan life, reinforcing an unyielding code that tolerated no deviation. For those who could not maintain this standard, life became a prolonged punishment. The infamous designation of trembler was not simply an insult, it was a sentence. Men who showed cowardice in battle or failed to meet the Spartan code were not exiled, for exile might be too merciful. Instead, they remained in the city as living warnings. They were denied the right to marry, to vote, or to share in communal meals, the core social rituals that defined citizenship. Even children were encouraged to mock them. Their garments were purposefully ridiculous, often featuring patches of color or asymmetrical cuts to make them instantly recognizable and eternally ridiculous. These men were reduced to cautionary tales, their humiliation a constant public spectacle meant to keep others in line. Sparta's commitment to its values extended into death. Only two kinds of citizens were deemed worthy of a marked grave: men who died in the fury of battle, and women who perished during childbirth. All others were laid to rest without ceremony, their tombs unmarked, and their names forgotten. In Sparta, to die usefully was the final duty. It was not the act of dying that mattered, but what you died for. Only death in service to the collective could elevate one's legacy beyond the grave. The emotional spectrum of Spartan life was narrow by design. Love, grief, wonder. These had little function in a society structured around obedience and war. Artistic expression existed, but only under strict conditions. Music and poetry were permitted, but they had to reinforce martial values. Songs were chants designed to inspire cohesion on the battlefield, not reflections of personal longing or divine beauty. Poetry was brief and utilitarian, stripped of metaphor, purpose-built to harden the soul. Theater and storytelling, so central to other Greek city-states, were seen as distractions. Philosophy, unless it served to buttress Spartan values, was regarded with suspicion. Even humor had its place only if it served as a form of social correction, sharp, dry, and controlled. To exist in Sparta was not merely to follow the rules. You had to embody them. Thought, gesture, speech, each had to align with the imperatives of the state. There was no sanctuary for dissent or difference. The state did not only govern your actions, it laid claim to your internal world. From birth to death, you were forged, monitored, and judged. You were not a citizen in the sense we might understand today. You were not a man, a father, or a dreamer. You were a tool, a living, breathing weapon. And if you dulled, you were discarded, not with pity, but with deliberate, visible contempt. If you had somehow found yourself within the militarized boundaries of ancient Sparta, part of a world more steel than soul, the experience would become ever more exacting with time. In your earliest years, you might have clung to the naive hope that age would deliver you from constant vigilance, from the punishing rhythms of discipline and austerity. But that illusion would break early. In Sparta, survival meant you were merely being reshaped for your next role. No one aged out of duty. From youth to old age, your body and mind remained extensions of the city-state, tools never fully at rest, only repurposed. The elders of Sparta, members of the revered Gerousia, were not figureheads or quiet observers of tradition. They were the spine of the government. 28 hardened veterans over the age of 60, elected for life, bound to serve with the same unrelenting precision expected of soldiers. These were men who had not only survived but thrived under a system that had no room for fragility. Their judgment was feared and final. They presided over trials, shaped legislation, and even held the power to veto decisions made by the kings. Their influence wasn't just legislative, it was spiritual. They kept the city's ideological flame alive, judging what was truly Spartan and what was a threat to its survival. But for every elder granted a seat at the council, there were dozens more who faded into a quieter punishment. If a man failed to meet the state's expectations, or worse, if he exhibited signs of hesitation or fear in combat, he earned a mark far worse than death, a lifetime of disgrace. The title of Trembler was not just an insult, it was a brand. These men were stripped of all civic rights. They were forbidden from marrying, from sharing meals at the communal mess halls, and even from entering the agora. Their clothing was altered so they could be identified instantly, often with half-shaven beards or garish patches sewn into their cloaks. They became social ghosts, seen but unacknowledged, pitied by none, ridiculed by all. Spartan society knew no mercy for the fallen who had not died gloriously. The collective memory of the city refused to store names that didn't bleed for it. In life, the demands were unyielding. In death, only two paths led to remembrance. A marked grave was reserved for men who died on the battlefield, and women who perished in childbirth. Every other death was treated as a mundane expiration. No name carved into stone, no tribute paid. Your existence was recorded only in whether you had lived well enough to die usefully. Sparta did not mourn. Mourning was for the weak. The city celebrated sacrifice and shunned all other ends. Art, if it could be called that, functioned as another limb of the war machine. Music was rhythm for marching, chants for combat, and melodies to stiffen the resolve before battle. The verses of Spartan poetry lacked ornament or ambiguity. These weren't poems for reflection. They were instructions, affirmations of state doctrine. There were no tragic plays, no comedies of manners, no philosophical dialogues performed in shaded groves. The arts had to serve. A flute might be heard on the field before a charge, never in a concert. A poem might be memorized, but never questioned. The emotional vocabulary of a Spartan was deliberately narrow. Joy was permissible only in victory. Anger was accepted only in war. Love might be reserved for country, and even then it was closer to reverence than affection. Compassion was confined to the most private, guarded corners of life, if it existed at all. The heart, like the spear, was kept sharp and aimed outward. The interior life of a Spartan was shaped to be as disciplined as their outer posture, measured, controlled, and above all, silent. In the end, the state's grip extended inward. A Spartan was not simply watched. He was hollowed and filled, instructed in what to feel, when to feel it, and when to destroy feeling altogether. Individuality wasn't suppressed, it was erased before it had a chance to take root. You weren't allowed to carry dreams. You carried shields. If your mind wandered too far from duty, your feet would be forced back onto the training ground, your thoughts hammered flat again. Living in Sparta wasn't just difficult. It was mechanical. Each man and woman was a cog in a war engine, calibrated to precision, punished for deviation. You weren't a citizen. You weren't a soul. You were an echo of state will, a shadow on a stone wall, your own story stripped down until nothing remained but the shape of obedience. In the heart of ancient Sparta, where olive trees grew wild, and the mountains stood like silent sentinels over the Eurotas Valley, daily life followed a rhythm that modern minds would find both alien and brutal. This was a society forged in discipline, where survival meant more than just growing food or earning a living. It meant obedience, strength, and sacrifice from the moment you drew your first breath to the instant you offered your last. Everything in Sparta bent to the will of the state, and the state demanded everything. If you were born in Sparta, your first challenge was not crawling or walking. It was surviving the inspection. Newborns were taken before elders who examined them for signs of weakness or deformity. If found wanting, the child could be abandoned at the base of Mount Taygetus, left to die by exposure. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was policy. The Spartan ideal valued the strength of the collective over the sentiment of the individual. The state could not be burdened with those it deemed unfit. But for those who passed the first test, life did not become easier. It only became more structured. Children were raised not by doting parents, but by the community. At age 7, boys left their homes to enter the Agaj, a rigorous, state-sponsored education and military training program. They were taught how to fight, how to endure pain, and how to suppress emotion. They were allowed only one cloak year-round, encouraged to go barefoot, and expected to steal food, not because theft was virtuous, but because cunning was. If they were caught, they were punished, not for stealing, but for being careless. Spartan girls, while not subjected to the Agaj, were far from exempt from the state's vision. They trained in physical fitness to ensure they would bear strong sons. They wrestled, raced, and threw javelins. Their lives were not about domestic tranquility, but about producing the next generation of warriors. In Sparta, even motherhood was a civic duty. As adolescents became men, the intensity only grew. Formal citizenship wasn't granted until the age of 30, and even then, military service continued until at least the age of 60. The army was everything. Sparta had no walls, famously claiming its warriors were its defense. Every male citizen was expected to be a professional soldier, ready at a moment's notice to defend the state or expand its territory. Luxury, comfort, and indulgence were seen as vices. Meals were simple, often consisting of black broth made of boiled pig's blood, salt, and vinegar. Housing was sparse. Clothing was utilitarian. And speaking was done with brevity and purpose, hence the term laconic, derived from Laconia, the region of Sparta. Words were weapons, not decorations. To live in Sparta was to be part of a relentless machine. You didn't own your life. You leased it to the state. Honor was measured in scars, worth in obedience, and legacy in whether your death served Sparta's ideals. Compassion existed but had to sneak in quietly between the cracks of discipline. Even the bonds between family members were filtered through the lens of duty. This society produced some of the most formidable warriors in history, but it did so at a cost: the erasure of softness, the banishment of weakness, and the sacrifice of individuality. And yet, for all its austerity, Sparta endured, feared, and respected across the ancient world. But in that respect was also a kind of sadness, the kind that comes when the soul is trained never to bend, even when it breaks. The twilight of Sparta's dominance was not marked by a single moment of catastrophe, but by an excruciating unraveling, drawn out over decades. When the Peloponnesian War finally concluded, Sparta stood atop a fractured Greek world, having defeated Athens and claimed victory. But beneath that triumph lay seeds of inevitable decay. The Spartan system, a rigid, austere model honed purely for war, was ill-equipped to manage peace. Its society lacked the commercial agility, cultural influence, and expansive reach that had defined Athenian greatness. There were no fleets of trade ships sailing from Spartan harbors, no colonies spreading its ethos across seas. Sparta had been shaped by centuries of internal discipline and military focus, and it was this very inflexibility that would ensure its fall. But before we wander further into this brutal unraveling of one of history's most famously harsh societies, I ask you to take a moment to support this journey. Tap the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. Whether you're resting in a quiet apartment, driving under stars on a lonely road, or lying awake somewhere far from Greece, it's always humbling to witness how the echoes of ancient lives reach across centuries to find us. Sparta's supposed strength, its unshakable simplicity, its relentless discipline, its monochrome focus on warfare, became with time its most dangerous weakness. Its entire foundation was built atop the backs of the Helots, an enslaved population that vastly outnumbered the Spartan citizens. These Helots farmed, built, and labored, while Spartan men trained endlessly for combat. The arrangement was always unstable, but as Sparta reached further across Greece, claiming influence over other city-states, the danger at home grew sharper. The warriors, stretched thinner with each campaign, left behind a homeland ever more dependent on terror to maintain control. Then came new challengers, and with them, the end of myth. Thebes, long overshadowed by its more dominant neighbors, rose with bold ambition and a revolutionary tactician in Epaminondas. In 371 BCE, at the Battle of Leuctra, Theban forces did what no Greek army had managed for centuries. They destroyed a Spartan force in pitched battle. Not only defeated, but humiliated, the Spartans saw their aura of invincibility shattered in a single day. Their fearsome hoplites, once the template for Greek martial excellence, were routed by Theban innovations. And in that loss, something intangible but essential evaporated. Across the Hellenic world, city-states that had once trembled at the sight of Spartan shields now saw weakness. The old order was ruptured. Meanwhile, within Lacedaemon itself, deeper fractures emerged. The citizen class, once a tight, disciplined elite bound by shared upbringing and purpose, was dwindling. To be a full Spartan, a Spartiates meant living up to brutal expectations, including land ownership and lifelong military service. But over time, wealth began to concentrate in fewer hands. Land that was once shared or rotated was hoarded. Inheritance, not merit, began to determine one's status. The result was fewer citizens, more inequality, and a dilution of the Spartan code. The system that had once guaranteed strength through uniformity now teetered on the edge of irrelevance. The famed agoge, Sparta's brutal training system that molded boys into warriors, also began to decay. No longer fueled by necessity or belief, it became a ritual observed by tradition rather than urgency. Young Spartans, many raised in homes of wealth and disconnection, found less meaning in silence and pain than their forebears. Some rebelled quietly, others abandoned the ideals outright. Apathy replaced purpose. Sparta had once produced men who could endure anything. Now it struggled to produce men who cared to try. In foreign policy, the cracks showed too. Once seen as the hegemon of Greece, Sparta could no longer impose its will without question. Former allies turned adversaries, and new powers emerged with broader vision. Sparta had spent centuries perfecting the art of staying the same, while the world around it learned how to change. And yet, even in its decline, Sparta refused to disappear entirely. The city remained, its stones still etched with stories of endurance. Later historians, particularly the Romans, romanticized the discipline and honor of Spartan life. They wrote of laconic speech and stoic courage, of children whipped into strength and warriors who fought to the death. Philosophers admired the frugality. Generals studied the tactics. Sparta became legend, even as its living influence crumbled. Back home, the training grounds no longer echoed as they once had. The rhythm of boots on earth grew faint. Old warriors aged into silence. The once proud barracks stood with empty spaces where boys should have learned to fight. Beneath it all was a question Sparta had no words for. Had the system been strong, or simply feared? By the 4th century BCE, the answer felt obvious. Sparta had been unmatched in war, but incapable of peace. It had inspired fear, but not progress. Its silence had once commanded respect. Now it was the silence of absence, not authority. And yet, the name endured. Sparta, not as a city of soldiers, but as a myth, a symbol, a warning carved into stone and memory. The image of ancient Sparta often conjures bronze-clad warriors, chiseled into marble by centuries of legend and cinematic flair. But behind that gleaming surface was a reality far harsher than most today could endure. This final glimpse into Spartan life will not revisit the glory of battlefields or the grandeur of hoplite ranks, but will instead trace the quieter truths, the intimate, unsharpened details of a society that was as brutal at home as it was heroic in war. Let us begin at the end. Death in Sparta. Not all were deemed worthy of grand burials. Only warriors who died in battle and women who died in childbirth were granted the honor of their names engraved on tombstones. All others were buried without distinction, their bodies laid without monuments. Death was not romanticized. It was weighed and judged based on the contribution to the polis. To live well in Sparta meant to die correctly, in service of the city or in bearing its future citizens. Everything else was silence. Even aging brought no relief. The elderly in Sparta were not revered unless they had achieved great deeds. Without children to support them, or absent battlefield glory to their name, old Spartans could find themselves neglected. There were no pensions, no soft landings. You were either a remembered warrior or a forgotten citizen. And for those who had once been helots, the enslaved underclass who toiled for generations beneath Spartan rule, their twilight years were likely spent with the same calloused hands and bent backs they had always known, with no titles or peace to ease the burden. Sparta's famed austerity echoed, even in leisure. Banquets were not occasions of indulgence, but of measured simplicity. The Spartan, black broth, a soup made of boiled pig's blood, vinegar, and salt, was legendary for its grim taste, but also symbolic of the culture's values. Pleasure was frowned upon. Art, music, and poetry, while not absent, were only tolerated when they served a greater moral or martial purpose. The individual spirit was subordinated to collective discipline. Children were conditioned from birth to suppress emotion. Displays of affection were minimal. A Spartan child might never hear "I love you" from their parents. Stoicism wasn't just taught, it was expected. Boys lived with other boys from age 7, trained to sleep on reeds they had cut themselves, taught to steal food and punished not for stealing, but for getting caught. Girls, though given more freedom than elsewhere in Greece, were still expected to mold themselves into future mothers of warriors. Their bodies were trained for childbirth, not pleasure. Their wit was sharpened to be fit companions to husbands who spoke in few words. Marriage itself was a strange affair. A Spartan man could not live with his wife until he was 30, even though he may have married in his 20s. Until then, visits were brief and in secret. Romantic connection was less important than reproductive success. Women shaved their heads and dressed as men on their wedding night, mimicking masculine traits to initiate what was otherwise a dispassionate union. Religion did not offer the comfort it did in other parts of the Greek world. The gods of Sparta were stern, warlike, and often invoked to reinforce discipline. Apollo, Artemis, and Athena were worshipped not for their beauty or poetry, but for their roles as patrons of strength, chastity, and war. Even festivals like the Carneia and Hyacinthia, which elsewhere might have been joyful, were disciplined, ordered, and politically charged. There were, of course, rare moments of warmth. In the gymnasia, under the sun, young Spartans sometimes found friendship that bordered on love. Bonds formed in hardship could be deep, even lifelong. But those connections were often framed in service to military cohesion. The idea of personal fulfillment, of living for joy, of carving out a self separate from duty, was alien. And so, if you lived in ancient Sparta, your life would have been measured not by how happy you were, but by how useful you proved to be. The price of that glory was steep. Your childhood would be stolen by discipline. Your identity would be absorbed into the state. Your pleasures would be pared down to necessity. And your legacy would be judged not by who you were, but how well you died. What we remember as strength, they lived as sacrifice. What we call discipline, they endured as deprivation. And what history has wrapped in myth was once a daily grind of cold mornings, bruised limbs, silent meals, and a life always watched by the state. Sparta did not raise individuals. It raised instruments, and most who lived within its walls were, in one way or another, broken before they ever had the chance to be whole.